Hello, my name is Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm talking about how does enlightenment affect thoughts and emotions? Well, it does indeed affect thoughts and emotions, and that's because enlightenment is a dispelling of ignorance and an arising of understanding. And all action and reaction arises from our current understanding or misunderstanding, as the case may be. And so when you dispel ignorance and change understanding, that is, understanding arises, that will necessarily affect the emotional reactions and the thought reactions that arise. Now I'll start with thought. Thought, by and large, dies down after enlightenment. It doesn't really come back. The moment, the here and now, is the most important. The feeling and experiencing of now. So all the focus is on now, which is also being. Our very being is in the now. So it's all here, and that's where the focus is. It's not that we can't think about past or future. It's just not that important. But when it's needed, it's there to be used. I mean, if I'm going into a meeting with a hiring manager to talk about updates, prior to the meeting, I can think about where we left off and what we've covered. And I can plan and think ahead of what we need to cover and where we need to be and prepare for the call. That's perfectly fine. It's just when that thought is finished, it falls away. It's not needed anymore. And after enlightenment, life is lived with a fairly much a daily absence of thought. Thoughts don't arise unless needed. So the normal state is silence of mind. Now the emotions change as well. And this is because emotions, by and large, are emotional reactions to stimulus. And so if you're in traffic and someone comes speeding by you at high speed and cuts you off at an exit, you might get ticked off and angry. There might be a little bit of road rage as you're going, what the hell's going on? Because your understanding is based on the assumption that he's just a inconsiderate driver who's in a hurry and doesn't matter about safety and doesn't matter about you being there on the road and what you need to do as well and the entire story behind it. However, if that was an ambulance and they had their lights flashing and they come zipping by at high speed and cut you off at an exit, there's no anger. You're not ticked off. No, because the understanding here is they need to get where they're going because it's a matter of life or death. They have precedence. Same situation, vehicle cutting you off, but it's the understanding that's different. On one side, you have assumptions based on how they're a bad or inconsiderate driver, and the other one you have got assumptions that it's a matter of life and death and that the ambulance has to get somewhere. I mean, for all you know, they just turn on the lights so they can get somewhere. It might not actually be an emergency. Like it's sometimes said a police might do. They might turn on their siren because they just want to get somewhere quickly. Abusing their power, so to speak. Ambulance and policemen, we assume, are doing something. And so when they speed by and cut us off or whatever, we're okay with it. But if it's somebody else, we're not okay with it. And the difference of application is based on our understanding. And so when our fundamental understanding changes, when ignorance is dispelled and a new understanding arises, this will necessarily affect our emotional reactions, because something that, say, happens that would have caused us grief, say our favorite coffee cup falls off the counter and shatters, and it was a gift that say from someone that was close and deceased. So this is one of the things you have to remember them by, so to speak. Based on the high emotional attachment to this item, there is the feeling of personal loss, a breaking of an attachment. It causes grief. However, after enlightenment, and you realize deeply that everything is ever changing, nothing is permanent, and that in the being that you are constantly, it is complete, lacking nothing, cannot be more or less than it is, cannot be added to or subtracted from. All these understandings and that arise with enlightenment may affect the emotional reaction. So if a favorite cup that has some significance falls from the counter and shatters, you may not grieve and be broken up in the same way someone who is still within the illusion of me and self-created suffering and attachment and all this other stuff may experience. The emotional reaction is different based on the understanding. Same happening, different reaction. And in this way, the emotional reactions change, where you may find loneliness just doesn't arise anymore. Because as there's only the self, you've always been alone. There's only been one. There's no other. At no point could there be more or less. And again, self is ever complete. And so loneliness may cease to arise after enlightenment. As I mentioned, sorrow, from the coffee cup, could be other things as well. The death of a person, the loss of home, whatever. These things may not cause sorrow anymore. Jealousy. Again, it needs two for there to be jealousy. And that illusion has been seen through. There's no other. So who is there to be jealous of? So yeah, envy, jealousy, sorrow, regret, shame, worry, anxiety, and fear. All of these are affected. By and large, it's the negative emotions that are affected. Because the negative emotions all arise from misunderstanding. They all arise from ignorance. I mean, hate would only arise in ignorance. There's only the self. There's no other. All hate is self-hate. And so when enlightenment happens and there's this deep realization of there is no other, there's no one to hate. In the absence of ignorance, there is only love. Now somebody might say, well, why is it the positive emotions can stay, but the negative emotions would go? Well, that's because our very being is love. Our very being is bliss. Our very being is truth. Because what is truth then what is? Truth is simply what is, and our being is what is. Love is self-love. There's always love of self. It's a fundamental thing. Even newborns love themselves. Because it arises from our very being. Our very being has this love, truth, It is learned thing to learn to lie. I mean, I remember my early childhood, being told as a young child to always tell the truth. And I remember the first time I was on the phone and Mama is standing right in front of me whispering, tell them I'm not here. We all encounter lie and are taught to lie. It's very unnatural. We don't usually come right out of the bat, wanting to lie. Even young infants, psychologists have shown a certain amount of care and compassion between each other. We have to learn to hate. We are not born hating somebody or something immediately. And so these negative emotions don't arise from being our natural inherent state. They're essentially taught to us and arise from misunderstanding and ignorance. And so when this misunderstanding and ignorance is dispelled, they tend to not arise anymore because their very seed and foundation that's required for them to arise, to have that reaction, is no longer there. And as such, they just kind of fall away. And what I mean by they fall away, it's by and large. I would say it's always dangerous to try to get absolutist, very black and white. Although I would say sadness and sorrow falls away with enlightenment. That's a generalization. But if you pointed out a particular, say, as I recall, Ramana Maharshi, when his mother died, shed a few tears. I would say it would be incorrect to point at that and go, he's expressing sorrow, so Ramana Maharshi wasn't enlightened. That would be incorrect. Because there is deeper conditioning. There's deeper things that come to the surface especially when major events that rarely, if ever, arise. And then we find out what might have not been seen suddenly arises. And it's not a mark of not being enlightened if a few tears are shed when mother or father dies. However, I would say by and large, the chronic suffering goes away. And what I mean by that is the shedding a few tears that day and then moving on is how Ramana worked. But if the days, weeks, months pass and you're still mourning and just can't seem to let mom go after she dies, well, then that would be a mark that enlightenment didn't happen. The chronic stickiness of the loss is persisting, and that can only persist with the misunderstanding and ignorance. And a me, to have had the loss, be allowed to claim that loss. And so while a event of shedding a few tears might not be indicating non-enlightenment, I would say the chronic daily, weekly, monthly is. And so when I say after enlightenment, suffering falls away, again, this is a generalization because it's not an absolute. I'm not saying absolutely all forms, even to the most, subtle forms, all disappear forever, never to show their face. That's not what I mean at all. It's a generalization. I mean, by and large, suffering falls away. This body, you could say karmically, genetically, whatever, had a predisposition for anger. Very, very young. outbursts of anger that reminded my mother of her sister. And she said I was exactly like her sister in the terms of the way anger arose. There was a look in my eye, she said, and just what happened. And so I've always known there's this predisposition. I would say it decreased substantially after enlightenment. Has not disappeared in its entirety. Not that it has to. Because then you have others like Nisargadatta Maharaj, who were known for their temper. He'd shout out and throw people out of his house. And he was widely considered enlightened. And somebody asked him, well, aren't you suffering when you're angry? And he says, no. This is just a bodily conditioning that's just going off. This vasana or, samskara or whatever. This conditioning is just executing. It's of the body, and the body's doing it. It has nothing to do with me. Now, I will warn you that kind of thought and direction can be used to excuse a lot of stuff and turn into a spiritual bypassing. But anger is not particularly something that you chronically suffer. Because as I said, although I still occasionally get angry, it's like a flash in the pan or a lightning strike. It's there and gone. There's no residual. If somebody does something and suddenly this flare of anger comes up and, I shout at them to, piss off or whatever, and it's there and it's gone. The next time I meet them, I'm not replaying that scenario again in my head and reliving it and carrying that anger. Every time I see them, I'm carrying it with emotional baggage for days, weeks, months, years after the incident. That's not what's happening. I find the anger that I still have arises quickly, falls away quickly, and is forgotten. There's no residual. It doesn't carry over from day-to-day life. If I meet him again, I'm perfectly happy to see him again. So the anger, the characteristic has changed. In the same way, I think that's how sadness might go for some, like Ramana. The sadness was there for a day, flash in the pan, lightning strike of sadness, and no residual. It didn't carry over days, weeks, months down the line. And so that's what I mean by chronic suffering, is it carries over. And then the next time you see them, you're still reliving it and holding it on them with all its emotional baggage. After enlightenment, there isn't emotional baggage. Emotional baggage is gone. You're not carrying that stuff anymore. And so, I think that's all I wanted to cover today. If you got any questions, comments, please post below. But until next time, thank you much.